Hi, everyone. This is Imran Amed, founder and CEO of the Business of Fashion. Welcome to the latest episode of BOF Live, our series of conversations with interesting thinkers, professionals, experts, and today, a legendary editor, Graydon Carter, who has kindly agreed to join us to talk about the future of media. Graydon, thank you for joining us. Tell us, where are you right now? Because everyone's in a different place during the pandemic.
Well, we got stuck in France. We were going to be heading back to New York in late June, but the renovation on our apartment was sort of stopped halfway. So we're going to stay here. It's not a punishment by any stretch. We're down in Provence, and we will leave at the early spring to go back to New York.
Got it. Are you missing New York?
I'm missing my family and I'm missing my friends, and we live in Greenwich Village. I have a 2-minute walk to work, and I'm missing my colleagues at the office. Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Well, these are really trying times in the world. And before we specifically talk about the topic at hand, which is, media, a topic you and I are both very passionate about, since you are such a wide-ranging thinker and you talk to so many people and you probably have a number of different perspectives and ideas that you're discussing with the people in your life personally and professionally, I'm just curious how you're interpreting and making sense of what's happening in the world right now. Starting with a pandemic and an economic crisis, and now global protests around racial equity. It's hard to ask anyone to give predictions, but as you think about this moment that we're living through, how do you think it will stand up in history?
I mean, I don't think a lot is going to come out of the pandemic, other than people may realize more of a life of the mind that they didn't have before, and they became more comfortable being by themselves rather than rushing around in the rat race. The protests, I think great things will come out of this. I think that George Floyd was clearly a noble person. The horrifying images of his death, I think, really shook people. And I see this lasting a good long while and having quite an effect on how America, comports itself, and how it treats, how it divides the spoils of the wealthiest nation on earth, and a country that thinks of itself as exceptional and the greatest country on earth. And I think it's got to, it has a chance, if it makes changes, to become that again.
Yeah. And, you've been no fan of Donald Trump over the last few years. I remember some of your letters at Vanity Fair. I mean, the other thing, of course, that's really been exposed is just a complete lack of leadership in terms of the way, at least at the federal level.
Well, he got rid of almost department by department. He got rid of all the experts that were, part of the so-called deep state. And I think Boris Johnson did a similar thing in England. And the best thing is to not try to be the smartest person in the room. Much better to be surrounded by people who are smarter than you. I think Trump was so insecure, and he ran his company in not a big company. It was sort of a jerry-rigged operation. And I don't think he was at all fit for the sort of leadership you need at a time of crisis. Hard enough when things are going well, but when you had this 1-2 slam of the pandemic and then the protests, and he's handled it appallingly, both of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I go back to 1983 with Donald Trump. I did a story. His first major story on him was signed by GQ magazine, and I was working at Life magazine at the time. And I spent 3 weeks with him, and I got to see what he was. And so, I mean, the funny thing is that he hated this story so much. It was a cover story. He hated it so much that he had his staff go and buy up all the magazines they could get their hands on in New York City. And Cy Newhouse, who was the proprietor of Vanity Fair and Vogue and everything else at Condé Nast, also owned Random House. And he saw the sales of GQ with Trump on the cover, and they were so much better in New York than previous covers. We went to the people at Random House and suggested they get him to write a book, and then The Art of the Deal comes up. So it was all built on a falsehood. Those first steps to sort of public acclaim in these days.
And you had a small role to play in that, having written that article.
Well, also I noticed one thing he hated about it was that I noticed that he had very small, they're very well manicured, but very small hands. And when we started Spy Magazine, we'd make up these sort of funny epithets for people. And with Donald Trump, it was, we called him a short-fingered vulgarian, which he really hated. And he threatened to sue us numerous times, and here we are. I mean, I think he's what for America to rejigger itself and do the right thing, he's got to go in November, period.
Yeah. Well, the latest polls I've seen, a number of them say Joe Biden is now the favored candidate, pretty much everywhere. So
I know. I'm not a big believer in polls. It backfired the last time. And I was so shocked and so depressed when I woke up after the election in November 2016. I thought I couldn't believe this could happen in America, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're here to talk not about politics, but about the future of media amidst this changing landscape. And, I thought we could actually go back, Graydon, to when you first, got into magazines. Like, what was it that first drew you to this magical world of glossy magazines in the first place? And what was it like for you?
Well, I grew up in Ottawa in Canada, as you did. And, but I wanted, for some reason, the world of magazines bring the world to you more than newspapers do and more than books do. They bring the sort of cultural nuances of what's going on now to your door. And, we subscribed to Time Magazine and Life Magazine. And when I became a teenager, I subscribed to Esquire. And they told you about a world outside the little small town you're living in. And so I loved magazines. And I thought I didn't know anybody in the magazine business. Ottawa had, bureaucrats and professionals, and that was about all it had. But I managed to get a job at Time. I started a magazine when I was in Canada. I co-started it with a fellow by the name of Graham Pomeroy, and he taught me a lot about what makes a magazine. It was a literary political magazine. It wasn't very good. We ran it for 5 years. We sold it to our closest competitor, and I was out of work. But I learned a lot what not to do. I tell my kids all the time that almost nobody learns from a success. You really only learn from a failure, and this was a failure. And so I managed to get a job at Time in New York, which was then an extraordinary place to work. The quality of the writing, the quality of the writers was extraordinary. And when I joined there, Michi Kakutani was a writer. She went on to become the chief book critic at the New York Times for 35 years. Frank Rich, who then went on to be a star at the New York Times, was there. Maureen Dowd, who's still at the Times, was there. My co-editor at Airmail, excuse me, Alessandra Stanley was there. Walter Isaacson was there. Jim Kelly, who was my closest friend, he and I started a week apart. He became the editor of Time. My partner, Kurt Anderson, was there. It was an amazing time, and we all still stayed close to each other, and that was my getting to New York and getting that job was like a dream.
And then Vanity Fair, how did that happen?
Well, there were steps along the way. So I went to Life magazine. Then Life was when I was really bored all the time. And so we had this idea for a monthly satirical magazine about New York. So Kurt and we did Spy magazine, and we ran that for 5 years. And at one point, Cy wanted to buy it, and I foolishly rejected his offer. But then we sold it to John Pagazzi and Charles Saatchi in like 1991. And I went to edit a newspaper. I sort of took over this newspaper and redid it. It was called the New York Observer, and it was quite successful. And once I got it going, I started sending comp copies to editors I knew all over in the country and in Europe. And Cy, who owns Vanity Fair, would take two annual trips to Europe and to visit his editors. And in each editor's office he visited, he'd see a copy of the New York Observer. So he comes back to New York thinking everybody's reading this paper. And he calls me up and asks me if, he said, look, I've got two opportunities and I wonder if you'd come over and talk about them. So we made an appointment for 2 days hence. I was really anxious about what these would be. So he says, yes, I mean, I've got two magazines I'd love you to edit. One is the New Yorker and one is Vanity Fair. And I said, wow, I was, wow. And I said, well, you know, we sort of spent the last 5 years making fun of Vanity Fair at SPY. If there's a choice, I'll take the New Yorker. He said, okay, that's it. And so for the next 2 weeks, with my family and with my friend Jim Kelly, you know, I worked on a plan to, like, you know, sort of redo it a bit over. I had a 9-month plan, an 18-month plan, and a 24-month plan. And then the day it was supposed to be announced, I got a call from Anna Wintour, said, it's not that magazine, it's the other one. So she said, but Cy's going to call you and act surprised. So Cy calls me and says, actually, it's going to be Vanity Fair. And I said, that's great, I'll take it. And I was so naive. I thought if I didn't start right away actually producing an issue, that I wouldn't get paid. And I had 3 kids at the time. And so I started without a plan, and it took me 2 years to fully get my feet under the desk and you know, sort out the staff. I didn't fire anybody when I went in, and then 2 years in, I got rid of 4 people who I thought were, you know, weren't not interested in my success there. So and after that, I had 23 years of relative happiness.
Yeah, I mean, it's a career that, you know, many of us fellow editors and reporters and journalists have looked upon with admiration. I'm curious to understand, you know, with that perspective that you have, you know, riding, you know, the kind of height of the success of Vanity Fair, you know, what is your perspective on the media landscape now in the context of the things that, you know, you and I were discussing at the beginning of the conversation? How do you see the role of media during this pandemic and the resulting economic and social crisis that has followed? And, you know, what do you see happening to the business generally?
Well, it's a complicated conversation. I mean, first of all, I think for me, I think there is more good journalism being produced now than there was 25 years ago. There are more venues. They're not traditional as they were back in the day when it had to be, you know, part of a large magazine company and then working for an individual magazine. But the fact is now that you know, in those days, you needed to work for somebody who had owned the means of production, you know, a Time Incorporated or Condé Nast or Hearst. Nowadays, you can start your own thing, and you can do it on your kitchen table. And the difficult part is getting somebody to come to read your things. The hard part is standing out. The media, magazines and newspapers took a beating in 2008 because, you know, when companies were close to going under, the easiest thing to cut is their advertising budget, because it doesn't involve laying off people so much. You barely notice it when it's gone. And I was surprised that it didn't come back in 2009, 2010. So newspapers took a bashing. And then at the same time, the internet picks up speed, so that if you're a daily newspaper, you know, you're waiting 24 hours for the next edition to come out. The internet is just exploding with fresh information on every minute. So I think newspapers took a real hit in the early stages after the recession. In New York City, Mike Bloomberg wanted to renovate the newsstands in the city. They were, you know, a lot of them were all different. They were privately owned. Most of them were owned by veterans. They didn't make a lot of money, and they wanted to spruce them up, but the newsstand owners would have to pay for that. So a lot of them just shuts. And you know, every once in a while, when you see a newsstand in New York, it's like seeing a horse on the streets. They're so unusual, and I miss them. And so right now, I think that the coronavirus will be and the subsequent economic problems will cause further problems in the magazine business. We didn't lose any advertising at Vanity Fair, at Airmail. Our advertisers moved to later in the year, but I think that magazines print is in, it's going to have its issues. And I think the strong magazines will survive and thrive, and the weak ones will go away. And that is sort of a natural process in any industry. I think big companies are no more safe than small companies when it comes to publications. But I think that, and I think it's easier in a funny way, starting Airmail, it's easier creating something new digitally than it is transferring something from print into digital. I think it's like trying to turn a horse into a camel. It doesn't, it works in some instances, but in most instances, it doesn't work. So I love being in the print business. I love the feel of magazines. And I think that young people will love magazines again. There'll just be different kinds of magazines. There won't be weekly magazines of news. There'll be magazines of thought and of photography and art, and they'll pay, 15 pounds for them at one of these sort of universal newsstands. So I don't think they'll go away, but they won't quite be like vinyl when it comes to with recordings. But there's a certain romance for magazines, I think, still among younger people, and especially among older people.
You said earlier that the strong magazines will survive. And I do want to talk about Airmail and the business model there, because I'm quite interested in it. But before we move on to that, what makes a strong magazine now, do you think? And is it different from what made a strong magazine, when you were running Vanity Fair or Spy or any of these other?
Well, I learned the reason my magazine in Canada failed was because it was sort of a general interest political literary magazine, but it didn't really have a point. It was just there. And I learned this in the restaurant business too. A restaurant that had a point thrived. A restaurant that didn't have a point to it didn't thrive. So I think a magazine that has a great connection to its readers will do well, and one that has a distant relationship to its readers will not do well.
Right.
As simple as that. I mean, the fact is, obviously, fashion magazines are going to have a hell of a time right now because they shoot their big, September, October, November, December issues over the last 3 or 4 months, and they can't do that. So I think Italian Vogue did a very clever thing. They did all illustrations, which can be done from home. And so it's hard to know, but I do think if you connect with your readers on a magazine and you sort of hit a chord with them, I think you'll do well. You have to be like in the first or second favorite magazine of your reader. I think then you do well.
Right. So that means there's going to be a lot that just don't survive this.
Yeah. If you're the 5th favorite magazine of a reader, they could probably do without you.
Yeah. Well, you've moved from this kind of print advertising model at Vanity Fair to a digital advertising subscription model at Airmail. And I'm curious about the decision-making process. What went through your mind to say, okay, the world needs another publication in a time when there's so many publications. So I guess to your last point, what was the point that you were, or what was the market space or white space that you were trying to fill? And what was the point of view you were trying to offer that wasn't already available?
Well, first of all, when I left Vanity Fair, I thought, okay, I can't, if you've edited Vanity Fair, there's no point in trying another print magazine because you had the greatest job of all time. And so we came to France, and I used to, my wife usually bring home all the foreign papers on Saturday and Sunday and cut out articles and bring them into the office and suggest stories for some of the writers. But when we got here, I did it digitally, and I would send interesting stories I thought to friends, and I thought, this this is something I could make into a business. I thought originally it'd be a primitive little newsletter with, and then I thought, no, I want it to look beautiful, and I want it to have, I don't want programmatic ads because I find them antithetical to a clean reading experience when they're moving across the page and jumping up and things going down the side and coming up at the bottom. So I wanted something that with old school values and fact checking and legal review and copy editing and photo research, but a new school way of distributing it. And I will tell you, if the internet existed 33 years ago when we started Spy Magazine, I don't think we would have printed it. I think it would have been online only. So I wanted something that I could build and operate from a distance. So we built this incredible platform from scratch. And, you know, the staff is in London, the staff is in New York, the staff is in Long Island, the staff's in Connecticut. And we put it together with as easy this week as it would have been a year ago when we started, when we were all together in New York, by and large. And I wanted something, I didn't want it daily because I didn't want to work that hard. And I didn't want a monthly because I thought monthly's too slow. And a weekly actually agrees with me. I love the schedule because a monthly is just just constant chaos because there are no dividing lines of when things are supposed to close and get out of the way. But with a weekly, you know what you have to do by Tuesday at noon, what you have to do by Wednesday at noon, and it's all very clear. Furthermore, I find that having a 6-hour jump on New York is a great advantage because I can get all my work done before they wake up. And then all you have to do, you can just talk to them. And I used to do that at Vanity Fair. I'd generally wake up, read the papers, do all my correspondence, all my phone calls, edit all my manuscripts. I wouldn't get into the office much before 11 or 11:30 because, and from then to the end of the day, it was just talking to writers, photographers, editors, you know, and trying to figure it, just to try to, you know, an editor's job is to make something that somebody is working on today seem like the most important thing they've ever done, and then turn around and do it 3 months hence and try to tell them that that's the most important thing they've ever done. And the same thing goes with photographers. So that was my job. And then the job of an editor also is to have a multitude of voices and a multitude of images, but somehow try to make it come together as a choir rather than just cacophony. Right. So that's the day job of an editor. And it hasn't changed that much, I'm sure, in 200 years.
Yeah. Well, I guess one difference with Airmail, Graydon, is that it's a smaller organization, and at Vanity Fair, you were probably more isolated from the business side of things.
Actually, really, but go ahead.
Okay, well, maybe you weren't, but then so maybe compare, you know, the business model, which is, I think, really important to discuss. You know, the advertising business model in glossy print magazines. You know, how are you making out with the business model of, you know, digital advertising and subscriptions? Because, you know, the weighting is different in terms of where you get the revenue, right?
One thing is I used to write thank you notes to my advertisers every month at Vanity Fair because they gave us $100,000 per page, and that $100,000 paid for the journalism. And I really appreciated it. Also, their ads were beautiful and made the magazine look better. So when I left, when I was starting Airmail, I wrote to 15 or 20 of them and to explain what I was doing and asking if they would be a sponsor for an individual week, because we have a single advertiser per week. The ads are beautiful, and I think the advertisers like it because it means they're not coming up against, you know, insurance company ads or you know, ISIS training videos or Geico ads for so it's a very clean experience for them, and it's a clean experience for us. It's better for the reader because I wanted an edition that nothing would move unless you asked it to move. I didn't want, you know, ads just all of a sudden jumping up and distracting you. And so we expected to get 50% from advertising and 50% from readers. We're probably about 65% advertising, 35% readers, but we're only, you know, 40 issues in, and I expect we thought it would take about 18 months to get that point.
Okay. Um, earlier we were talking about the kind of media industry generally, and like over the last few weeks in America, given everything that's going on, a lot of your former colleagues at Condé Nast and in other publications have been forced to resign amidst allegations of cultures of exclusion and racism. And what do you think this reckoning is going to lead to in terms of the way some of these long-standing media companies have to change in terms of the way they work and who they hire?
Well, I mean, I think if you create I don't even know what that means, a bro culture at an office, I think that is, that's harmful to the mission of whatever the magazine is. I think a toxic environment is harmful to the mission. I dealt with most Vanity Fair employees like one-to-one. There was no layering. So I would probably deal with, 45 to 50 staff members in a given week. And I deal with the Airmail. The Airmail staff's about 28. And I deal with them all individually, probably over the course of a 2-week period. But I think that, I don't know whether it's a reckoning. I think that, first of all, I don't know why people go on Twitter, because the number of people who've lost their jobs because of moronic things they've said on Twitter, it's a long list. I think most computers should have breathalyzers on them, because I think a lot of people do this when they shouldn't be doing it.
Drunk tweeting?
Yeah. I mean, I don't tweet, and I don't have an Instagram account, and I don't have a Facebook account. But the simple reason is I probably would say something moronic and lose my job.
Right. But media companies now are more focused on diversity than they were maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. Do you think there was a big issue around diversity in the way magazines have were created back then? And how do you feel about some of the changes that are now starting to be made?
To give magazines credit, I think, and newspapers credit, and journalism credit, I think there have been great strides and great efforts across the board in trying to make their staffs and their editorial more diverse and reflect more than just a white male version of the world. And I mean, we go out of our way to try to find new voices, because Airmail is an international publication. So we've got a lot of people of color who write for us, and that'll expand. So I think it's been an ongoing process. You can't turn ships around overnight, but I think that this will accelerate it. And I don't think any publication would turn away a candidate because of the color of their skin. I just don't think that's the case. I think it's based on talent and more than anything else.
So what got in the way then, Graydon, of the voices that are emerging now saying that they were never treated fairly, or that they were never given a fair shot, even if they were inside these companies, like having their voice? What do you think is the systemic issues that may have gotten in the way?
I mean, hard to tell. I mean, the fact is, if you're really clever and you're an African American, I mean, journalism is not the best paying profession. If you're really talented, you can write books, but banks are trying to hire these people at like 5 times the rates of magazines. So I do think there'll be a change, that young African Americans will see the fact is they can have an impact in journalism that they would not have had if they went to become an associate at a large bank. And they'll maybe make less money, but they might have a more fulfilling life and have a richer sense of self.
Yeah.
Journalism, a wonderful profession. Nobody goes in it to get rich, but you're going to have a great time and hopefully do some good work.
Yeah. Well, I can certainly relate to that. I wanted to talk to you also about, the kind of, if you look at Airmail and if you look at Vanity Fair, there are certain similarities in some of the tone, and maybe even some of the design and aesthetic, but also in terms of the focus on these kind of aspirational lifestyles, or people of power or privilege or great wealth. and kind of digging in a bit into their lives and kind of, in some ways, holding them to account. I just wonder, in the context of, a growing band of voices around diversity and, different lifestyles, if you think that original formula of the kind of aspirational lifestyle, how that's changing now in light of some of these shifts in social movements and whatnot.
I mean, it's hard to tell. I think the word billionaire is more of a pejorative than it was 3 years ago. I do think that, for good journalism, what you need is, elements that you need. Narrative, you like a beginning, middle, and end to a story. You like access, which helps with the story, especially in the terms of Vanity Fair, because you needed photography. And you need a conflict. I think stories are always better when companies, nations, or people are at odds. And you need disclosure. And the fact is, you've got to be able to move the scholarship of the subject along. So that, I don't think that's going to change. I do think that people love stories about people rising up in the world, and they like stories about people falling down in the world. And I don't think that's going to change. But I think woke should be an element of a publication, and woke as we describe it these days, and inclusion, but it can't be the mission if you're a general interest publication. That should be part of your worldview, but not the only part of your worldview.
Well, while we're on the topic of billionaires, I did want to ask you about the controversy surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. And, I did go and read the story, The Talented Mr. Epstein, that Vanity Fair published during your tenure. And, having read the story, it's by no means an entirely positive, flattering story, but this writer, Vicky Ward, has said that you edited out important details of Epstein's abuse, which is now well known. And I wonder if you could set the record straight on what happened and why, in a world where you were actually trying to get those kinds of scoops about powerful people who might not be, behaving properly, why it didn't get included in the story, and what you think that says about that story now in light of everything that's happened.
Well, over the course of 25 years, I probably edited between 4,000 and 5,000 stories, and every one of those goes through a rigorous system of a senior edit. The editor of the story will edit something, copy editing, fact checking, and legal review before that story, and editing by myself before that story goes into print. And the legal and fact-checking elements of Vanity Fair, which was quite extensive. We had a lawyer read all copy as well. That is your line of defense. And my head of fact-checking, my legal review editor, and the lawyer for the company said, we simply did not have what we needed to print this. And it came in late. If it had come in a month or two earlier, we might have had time to change that. And so the writer, Vicky Ward, we published the story. She wasn't exclusive to us. She could have gone anywhere with that story the next day, but she didn't. For 13 or 15 years, she did nothing with it. In fact, she wrote a glowing story about them in 2013, where she talked about how charming Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell are. And so the fact is, it actually, you make decisions at a big magazine like Vanity Fair. You do not do them individually. You rely on the staff around you. And I always say that 75% of the time, pretty much know what to do, but 25% of the time you are in doubt. And that's when you have a circle of very talented, very skilled colleagues to help make the decision. And in this case, they said we did not have the information we needed to publish that little bit of information in the story.
Yeah. And do you have any regrets now about that, knowing now what you know?
We were almost going to press, and perhaps if I'd felt the information was stronger, I might have held the story, which is very complex when you're a part of the magazine already been printed. I would have loved to. That's the sort of story I would have loved to have broken, but we didn't have what we needed, and I felt so sorry because I you know, I have two daughters, and I mean, I think that he is so much worse than one could have ever humanly imagined, and I feel great pain and sorrow for the women he took advantage of. I just do. I think it's and there it's an appalling situation. And if I had met him knowing all of this, I probably would have strangled him.
Okay, well that sets the record straight for sure. Let's go back to Airmail, because you're about to land on your first year anniversary, and I'm curious, you know, having you know, launched this completely different kind of publication, at least for you, you know, what would you do differently now? Like, what have you learned about launching a digital only publication that maybe you wouldn't have expected?
Well, the staff is bigger than I anticipated. It's I brought my old, we have these wonderful offices down in the village, and I brought we'd sold our house in the village, and I had a 17-foot long, so quite narrow dining room table, and the goal was to keep the staff small enough that we could all fit around this table. And you know, before the first issue was published, we'd already expanded beyond that. Originally, I wasn't going to assign many stories. I was just going to buy the rights to serialize stories in the foreign papers. And I thought, and that just stories I found interesting that I thought friends in America or friends in France would find interesting. But it didn't work out that way. That actually about 85% of the stories are stories we've assigned. And strange enough, the stories we assigned do better than the ones that we didn't assign. That said, we still, you know, we try to find great stories. My co-editor, Alessandra Stanley, an amazing person. We started off at Time magazine together back in the late 70s, early 80s. But she, I didn't know this when I asked her to be my partner in this. She speaks 5 languages. She speaks Spanish, Italian, Russian, and French. So she reads a wide array of foreign publications. And so she will pepper me with things from outside areas that I know nothing about. She also happens to be the only person I've ever met. I've known her for 40 years, and I only found out a year ago by accident through another person that she'd gone to Harvard. And most people, friends of mine, have gone to Harvard. They usually sort of somehow let you know within 10 or 15 minutes that they've gone there. She keeps all her talents under a bushel. She's very discreet, and she's one of the funniest women I've ever met. So we have a blast doing this. And you know, it's more, I thought I'd be working about 3 hours a week, but I'm 3 hours a day, I should say, but I'm probably working, you know, six hours a day. And but
how does that compare to Vanity Fair you know, when you were there?
Vanity Fair, you know, similar. I probably worked about, you know, 35. I work every weekend as well, so it's about the same.
It's about the same. But I've noticed
this time next year, it's much less.
Yeah.
Other things I should be doing.
Yeah. I've noticed, you know, you went from sending one email on a Saturday to sending many more emails during the week. There's like a kids email, and there's a culture email. Is that because you realized in that Saturday email there was so much stuff in there that people just didn't get through it all?
There's a bit of that, and then the sort of experts said you got to have reader engagement more often. I said, well, look, I don't want to pester people, and I don't want to become a bother, and I still like them to look forward to the Saturday email. And so this has been a test to see whether we're knocking on your door too often, or rather than knocking on your door too little. So it's everything. The nice thing about the internet, everything can be a test.
Yeah, and that's the best part, right?
Yeah. Like we changed our logo. It was originally, you know, in March, our logo underneath the Airmail airplane said "For the World Traveler." So in March, around the middle of March, I said, nobody's traveling, so we just change it for the world citizen. And at a certain point, we'll go back to traveler, I'm sure.
Right. Speaking of your logo, another innovation that I spotted was the little physical newsstand that you've branded on one of my favorite streets here in London, Chiltern Street,
Yes.
Shriji News. Help me understand the business strategy, Graydon, of a digital publication sponsoring a physical newsstand when you don't have a physical publication.
Well, we don't sponsor it. So I had absolutely nothing to do with starting this up. Anjali Lewis, who works on the business side, had been talking to Gabriel Chipperfield, who is a designer and architect. And he came to Anjali with the idea that he wanted to redo the Shriji newsstand, and that they wanted to do it with Airmail. And I thought it was a wonderful idea. I mean, I love newsstands, and I realized we don't sell anything there. It's sort of, he designed it. And he runs it with Shriji, and they curate. Shriji still curates his magazines, but I think it's one of the most beautiful newsstands in the world, and I'm thrilled. And we think we might do others. Newsstands bring life to a block the way few other entities do. If you run a shopping mall, I would think putting in a beautiful newsstand and sort of redoing what a newsstand can be would be very attractive. The same thing goes, like say along Bleecker Street in the Village. I mean, it was just all boarded up long before, even before the coronavirus, because of high rents and greedy landlords. And I thought, you put a newsstand in the middle of one of those blocks, and all of a sudden you'll start getting foot traffic, and that's good for all the little shops that could open up along there. So I think it's a force for good. It makes absolutely no sense, but I love it.
Right. Well, I think it's really, really well executed. I haven't been able to physically go there myself, but the pictures I saw looked amazing.
Yeah.
Last question, Graydon, because there's a lot of young or even not young writers, editors, reporters who've joined us today, who look up to you. What's your advice now as we think about the future of media and where things are going? Like where can some of these people focus their energies, and if you were advising them?
Well, the one thing the internet does in a way is allows you to be narrow but deep, to become an expert on something. There's some guy who fact checks all of Donald Trump's comments, and he became, overnight the sort of go-to guy for somebody trying to find out is this real or not. And if you want to write about old-fashioned, wooden calendars, and you do it really well, you can build an audience and get advertising. It may not be my cup of tea, but so I think that it's about specialization rather than being broad in a certain way, but just doing it well, and everything else will flow through. If you work hard and you've got a modicum of talent, I have minimal talents at almost anything, and I've done pretty well, but I worked hard. I think being decent to other people helps, and I actually love partners. I think that anytime you do something, I had partners in the magazine business, and I've had partners in the restaurant business. I love having a partner. It gives you, you share the glory, but you share the pain, and it gives you got two brains instead of one. And I find it wonderful. I know for Airmail, if anybody has a story suggestion, we have an inquiry portion at the bottom of every issue, and a number of story ideas have come in through there. So I've always been open to new writers, and they come from sometimes the most surprising places. But I value great cartoons, great artwork. We have a lot of art. We have some of the best artists working today, from Ed Sorel to Barry Blitt to Jim McMullen, who's done all the posters for the Lincoln Center Theatre for the last 30 years. David Downton, who's in the Fashion Illustrator in London. So I care a lot about illustration. I'm a crappy one myself, illustrator. So I think that I think there will be new opportunities through all of this period of upheaval. But I do think the digital world will provide a new way of making a life in journalism. I just do. I think that rather than having to work your way up at the New York Times or you work your way up at Time Magazine, things are different now. And some of it, for the worse, I think people will miss the fun of an office, because I think an office is a second family. There's a reason so many successful TV shows are set in an office situation. It's because outside of your family, that is for your family. You probably spend more hours a day with waking hours with the office family than you do with the real family in some cases. So, I think there's opportunities there, but it's just a question of being good and doing something that somebody else doesn't do as well. And that goes to the thing of just have a point. So that if you produce the greatest website on wooden day calendars, that some people start finding you. And if you do it,
that's the second time you've used that example. Is it a real life thing that you've seen?
I've been looking at this across my desk.
Oh, right.
and no, it could be fountain pens. It could be binder clips. That you can make a name doing anything as long as it's done well.
Right. Okay. Well, on that note, and that piece of very valuable advice, I mean, as someone who runs a publication that is a specialist publication but global, it definitely relates. I definitely relate to what you're saying, because
you took on women's wear and look what happened.
Yeah. Global niches. We're all into global niches. Graydon, thank you so much. I hope you stay safe in the south of France. And thank you for your time and your advice and your candid replies. This is Imran Amed, founder and CEO of the Business of Fashion. Thank you for joining us for BOF Live. We have lots of these events every single day. So check out businessoffashion.com/events. You can see the full calendar. Next week, we're hosting a very special summit, how to build a responsible fashion business. You can find out all the details on the BOF website. We have an amazing group of speakers. We're going to be talking about sustainability, racial justice, garment workers' rights, and a variety of other topics related to building responsible fashion businesses. Please join us then. Thanks again, Graydon.
Bye-bye. Thanks.